Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you from the Colonial Dungeon, this is the Court-Martail Podcast! Introducing your host for this evening, he has a bald spot on the top of his head, and he weighs in tonight at a number you don't need to know. He is the Colonial Loudmouth, Sean McCarty!
And welcome to another spectacular edition, a little bit late, but another spectacular edition of the Court-Martail Podcast. I am, as always, your Colonial Champion, Sean McCarty, and we have a lot to talk about today. It's a couple days past when I typically release one of these podcasts, and the reason why is that we had a fun little hurricane called Hurricane, I don't even remember the name of it. Isaiah Sun or Isosmosis or the big old storm. Hurricane Big Ol' Storm, as I'm going to call it, swept through my portion of where I live and knocked out power to almost 900,000 in my state. And as a result, we did not have power all the way for at least 4 or 5 days, until the Colonial Mother finally made a call, put some boots to asses, took the stomp, put Eversource into the corner, gave it an elbow, go to the top rope, hit it with the relaxed elbow, and knocked it down for the count and made them tap. And now we are here today to present to you, because of that kind of proactive booking and that proactive wrestling expertise, we are now back in action to provide you with all of the quality entertainment that you so deserve. And so that is why we are here on Saturday, potentially Sunday morning, depending on how long it takes to edit. But we are here, we are excited, and we are still standing with power. We have the power, not NWA power, but we have the power, we have the water, we have everything we need to give you the best in pro wrestling entertainment today, here in the Court-Martail Podcast. So, as an explanation, and it's interesting to look back on some of the other weather-related issues in pro wrestling, such as that gigantic blizzard, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, that hit, ironically, Hartford, Connecticut, which is not too far from where I am, that also disrupted Monday Night Raw a few years ago. There have been a lot of different weather-related incidents, but we are still here, and as is typical with WWE at least, but with pro wrestling, as always, no matter what the circumstances are, the show must go on. So we've got a few things to talk about. We're going to start with wrestlers who wrestle past their prime and what they are able to contribute, if they are able to contribute to the wrestling business. Now, unfortunately, we have far too many examples of this being the case than not. And obviously the most notable example, at least in my opinion, is Ric Flair. Rick, who wrestled all the way until 2010, because I'm not counting his little KFC Colonel Sanders dress-up Battle Royal win, because that, even though apparently that's considered actually an official match and that he actually won it, I'm not counting that. And a lot of people don't even count his TNA run that he had after his big old farewell retirement match in 2008, which was just a beautiful swan song. One of the best retirements that anyone could ever get was the match that he had with Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 24. And a lot of people argue that Flair was definitely past his prime, but you could argue he was past his prime even in the 90s WCW. I mean, his bread and butter really was in the late 70s all the way through into the 80s, and then really once the whole Jim Herd wanted to turn him into Spartacus, which is why he left to join the WWF, and he was great in the WWF, winning arguably one of the best Royal Rumbles ever booked in the 92 Royal Rumble, and as well as many other accolades that he had, obviously working with Bobby the Brain Heenan, and then going back to WCW, and then working the rest of that, and then his issues with Bischoff, blah, blah, blah. The point is that his career, when he was past his prime, so to speak, that's one of those cases where he was just as talented, even though he wasn't doing as much because Flair didn't need to do much. And, you know, he was able to do what he needed to do in order to make his shtick work. And it worked for so long because it wasn't so taxing on the body that he needed to take all this time off to recover from injuries and surgeries and blah, blah, blah. And he's one of those examples where wrestling past his prime, he still was able to put on some really quality matches. I mean, although it's been said by Rick himself to his own admission that he had to have Shawn, or Shawn basically told Rick that Shawn was going to put together this match, and there was no debate about it, which sounds very much standard Shawn Michaels. And I guess that will transition from Rick to Shawn and to that and people like that, because Shawn really, his prime was definitely, I would argue, his prime was in the early 2000s when he came back from that surgery and when he had really cleaned himself up from all of his addictions and his demons. You know, he was having great matches prior to that, obviously. I mean, there's a lot of great matches leading up to 98 when he finally took that time off. But really what I remember best about Shawn Michaels is how well he performed and how good he wrestled after that moment. And after Shawn, quote-unquote, found God and did all that stuff. And how great his career lasted for another 10 years or so. Or 8 years, I guess, if you want to get technical. But then he comes back in 2018, and all four of those guys, Triple H, Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, and Kane, they were all past where they, way past their prime. Because they were in their 50s. And I don't know if there's specifically like an age, like a specific age that you can argue has better, for better or worse, is like the pristine time to go, because I think it varies with everybody. You know, Undertaker's prime was not at the same time as Shawn Michaels' prime, was not at the same time as Kane's prime, and so on and so forth. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about Dusty Rhodes later, but, you know, you see Dusty in his prime was probably in the 70s, and maybe in 84 when he and Flair were doing their whole thing, but he was much past his prime by the time that he donned the polka dots. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't able to still be captivating and make it work and really, you know, still do what he was able to do and still be something of a draw, even though in WWF's case, they were never going to treat him as the kind of draw that Dusty really was. And I don't know if that's a personal vendetta against Dusty just because Dusty had booked so many years against Vince and because of how the work he did for Crockett and all those things along those lines. But at the same time, that was another case where Dusty still had some oomph in him. But I think that with a lot of these guys, even though they know they're past their prime, they still don't want to admit that they can't go the way they used to go. And the best evidence of that, and I think most people can agree with this on this point, is The Undertaker. And I love The Undertaker. I always have loved The Undertaker. He was great. I always enjoyed his matches. And then probably 2012 comes along, and you could tell that Undertaker's starting to lose a step. He's still doing great stuff. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from The Undertaker. And then the streak comes to an end with Brock. And then it becomes Taker's only around for the streak. And then it becomes he does the Saudi Arabia stuff, and then he has to redeem himself. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of you who are watching this have already watched the Last Ride documentary that the network did with The Undertaker and his, you know, his kind of ride into the sunset type of deal. But in any event, you know, it's one of those things where he always said, when I don't have it, tell me, and I'll stop. And I don't think anybody really wanted to tell Taker to stop. And, you know, that's another big reason why we have, you know, the circumstances that are. And, you know, everyone really just wanted Taker to retire. And him doing that boneyard match with AJ, I thought was a perfect way to send him off. If he wanted to get into acting, he can get into acting. That cinematic, which is the only cinematic I've really loved, or even liked, because that one at least had, it was still a simulated fight, and Taker still sold as if it were a simulated fight, which is what pro wrestling at its core is simulated combat between two people who were allegedly mad at each other and wanted to beat the piss out of each other. And Undertaker always had that demeanor, but you could tell as the years went on that things just were not the same. The same with Sting. I mean, I like Sting too, but his run, I would say really up until about mid TNA, about 2012, 2013, Sting just wasn't the same. And again, it's no knock on the guy at all, because he's always had good matches, but they started to get a little slower and lankier, and they, I don't want to call them stinkers, but they weren't what they were. And it's natural. I mean, it's a natural thing to happen, and I don't think anybody should be accosted for getting back in the ring, at any age. But there comes a point where I think, because wrestling can often be something of an addiction for these people, at least from what I can infer from it, and especially from what, if you listen to Roddy Piper was a big advocate of saying, yeah, wrestling's a drug and I'm really fucking addicted to it, which is why I'm getting back at the ring in 55 and 56 and blah, blah, blah. And like Piper was very much in acknowledgement of that, and acknowledged that was the case. And I think there are a lot of other wrestlers who would probably attest to that. But there's also some people who can still contribute even past their prime. I don't want to say that when their prime is come and gone, that they're not still useful and valuable. I mean, Shawn, even though his early 2000s was his peak, and then he started going down from there, save for that Saudi Arabia match, that you'd be hard-pressed to give me a match that Shawn Michaels was in that wasn't at the very least good. Not everyone had to be great, but wasn't at least good up until the time he retired. And Mysterio, Rey Mysterio is obviously past his prime, but then he got into wicked shape and he kept going. Dustin Rhodes, another great example where his prime had passed, probably, given the fact that he was the natural and he had gone through all that stuff. His prime was probably probably at the same time, probably in the early 2000s, and then he had those issues with Black Rain, but now he's cleaned himself up, and Dustin looks better than he ever has. So it varies with each guy, and I don't think age is necessarily determinant of that, I think that each case when it comes to wrestling past their prime is different, and definitely attitude is a big part of it, and you want to pay it forward, and you want to be able to give back to the industry that you've loved so much, which I think is a big part of what a lot of these wrestlers do once they've reached that age, and they want to come back and still perform and still give what they can give, but they also want to be able to give back. It's really dependent on how much your ego plays into it. If your ego is saying, yes, I can still do everything that I used to do, and then you make an ass out of yourself, and it becomes about you rather than about the business, about giving back to the industry, I think that's where the fans start to detect whether somebody is losing their step. I don't know if that makes sense, because like Sting, when Sting came to WWE, it was a big thing where he wanted to get into the biz, but he was still going to give Seth that rub by working with him, and I feel bad that Sting just ended up, that buckle bomb did so much damage to him, and that we didn't get to see Sting at least accumulate one win in WWE. But at the same time, I don't think that it's hard to say with past the prime, like, should wrestlers continue past their prime? And obviously there's so much more they can give as veterans than they do as upstarts. And I think that comes a point where that ideal shifts. And I like older wrestlers, but there comes a point where you have to say, is enough enough? And not everybody can find that. Not everybody knows where that is, and not everybody will be able to know where that is. But that doesn't mean that we should accost these people for doing what they could do and to help people get over. And every case is different. And we're going to talk about that because, Terry Funk is still going. Well, he was. And I know, for those of you who don't know, Terry's been dealing with some health issues, so I hope that Terry has a speedy recovery and just was able to kind of rally himself up. I mean, for Christ's sakes, he's wrestling in his 70s. So there obviously comes a point where it's past the past prime. And there's got to be a point, but there's certainly a fine line between still got it and washed up. And that can bring wrestlers to do some pretty incredible things, both for good and for ill. And with that said, let's move on to another part in our little series of kayfabe breakers. We haven't done this one in a little while. The last one we did was the curtain call. And this one that we're going to do this week, I wanted to talk, I think we're going to talk a little more in depth about this at another time, but I want to talk a little bit about Montreal. Now, if any of you are listening to this podcast and don't know what I'm talking about, what are you doing here? You are listening to the smarkiest podcast you could possibly find. How did you get here and not know about the Montreal Screwjob? But in case you don't, I'm going to break it down in the most archaic, cavemanic terms. Shawn Michaels had issues, had his demons at a time, which mostly involved somas, and Bret Hart was going to WCW to get better pay. For the most part. Vince couldn't match the pay that WCW's offering, so Bret was going to leave. Bret and Shawn were going to work at Survivor Series in '97. Bret Hart offered Shawn that he was going to be professional. Shawn refused to be professional. They had a bunch of disagreements backstage. Shawn, from what I hear, was very insufferable as the type of person he was, and being overdramatic and unprofessional as far as, like, starting the riot when somebody hit him in the head with the can and said, "No, screw you, I'm not going to do the main event," and walked out. And, and Bret, who was trying to be the consummate professional, they were going to, in Montreal, because Bret viewed himself as the Canadian hero, because, again, as we talked about, egos are very prevalent in pro wrestling. Bret said, "No, I'm not going to drop the belt to unprofessional Shawn and my hometown of Montreal, or in my home country of Montreal. I'm not going to do it." And so they were trying to come up with a finish. Finally, from what I hear, Jim Cornette had the idea of, well, double cross him, Vince, because it's your belt. So Vince decided that on that night, he was going to Shawn Michaels was going to put Bret in the sharpshooter, which was Bret's finisher. At that moment, Vince McMahon ordered Earl Hebner to ring the bell. Earl rang the bell, ran out of the ring, got out of there, and Bret Hart was screwed. Bret spit in Vince's face, motioned WCW with his hands, destroyed stuff around the set, went back in, punched Vince McMahon in the face, and walked out, and that was the last of Bret in WWF until he came back in 2010. It was save for the 2005 Hall of Fame induction. So, what I want to talk about with this, and the reason I bring this up as kayfabe breakers, is that a lot of people have a side that they choose for this whole situation. And I would like to try to approach this from as objective a perspective as I can. On the one hand, Shawn Michaels arguably at that time really, I don't know what it was with Vince McMahon and what he had for Shawn Michaels, and there's been speculation as to their relationship, and I'm not at liberty to go into that. I know literally nothing about that, so I'm not going to put ideas into people's heads that aren't true or weren't, because I wasn't even there. It was Owen. Even though it wasn't Owen who was even there, even though he was forced to stay because of his contract, even though Bulldog and Neidhart left. But anyway, Shawn being Shawn, Vince was pretty set on Shawn Michaels getting the belt at the time. And Shawn Michaels was pretty set on Shawn Michaels getting the belt at that time. Recently, The Undertaker said, well, they could have used me to transition the belt from Bret to Shawn, but that would imply that Shawn would have been okay with the fact that Taker would have won the belt at Survivor Series and then Shawn would have won it later, which I don't think Shawn really was, because you have to understand the amount of political power that Shawn Michaels held, which is arguably more than any other pro wrestler, save for maybe Hulk Hogan. save for Hulk Hogan. But Shawn Michaels had more political power in the backstage of the WWE than anybody else at that time. To the point where there was a threat that Shawn wouldn't drop the belt to Steve Austin in '98, which is where we hear that old story where Taker was taping up his wrists in Gorilla, and then when the match went the way it is, he untaped his wrists and walked back in the locker room. So Shawn definitely had an ego to put into this equation. Now on Bret's side, of course Bret had an ego, but I think that Bret, all in all, would have remained professional about it had Shawn remained professional about it. Right? And Shawn just said, yes, let's just do this, let's drop the belt. We'll do this. This is the match we're gonna have. I'll put you in a sharpshooter. You can, get close to it. You maybe tap. I don't know what the original finish was supposed to be, but obviously to make Bret look strong going into WCW, which was not obviously the point. But Bret, I think, if Shawn had said in that interaction when Bret said, "I will be professional for you, if you will be professional for me," if Shawn had said, "Okay, let's do this. Let's get it done. I don't like you at all. I'd much rather spit in your face than do this for you, but this is professional. I'm going to be professional, and that's going to be the way it goes." I think that this wouldn't have happened. We would not have gotten this issue. But because Shawn was the way that Shawn was at the time, which has been well documented, and I don't think I'm breaking new ground here saying that Shawn Michaels had a lot of issues at that time, particularly with pills, and particularly with the way that he was able to control and go into business for himself, a la 1996 SummerSlam, if you need evidence. Now, on the other hand, Bret became a bit stubborn, and I don't want to say that he stooped to Shawn's level, because I don't think that's really fair to Bret. But I do think that Bret kind of wasn't willing to acquiesce the circumstances based on what had happened and what his personal relationship with Shawn was at the time. They had a backstage fight long before that had happened, and it seems like Bret always viewed Bret to be who he was on TV. Meaning, he cared not about, he didn't care about the money, he cared about winning and losing. He cared about what Bret was doing on the show, because he took that much devotion into his gimmick, which I respect. And honestly, when it comes to pro wrestling now, we need way more Bret Harts and way fewer people who emulate Shawn Michaels. Not saying that they're all pilled up or anything like that, but just the way that, just the attitude and the demeanor of taking the gimmick more seriously instead of being so blasé about it and being, But I think it's an interesting dynamic too, because Bret knew how good he was and Shawn knew how good he was. But Shawn was much more apt to weaponize his ability. And I think Shawn recognized that, and he was really the first to do that. Shawn was the first to recognize, hey, I'm pretty damn good at this. I could probably use the fact that I'm so good at this to not only make myself more money, but to cushion myself into a position where I never have to worry about my position in this company ever. And I won't have to take any bullshit from anybody. I won't have to take any crap, because if somebody gives me crap, all I have to do is snap my fingers and that person's going to be fired. And, and I think that Shawn definitely had that. And the rest of the clique, I think, followed Shawn's lead on that. You could argue Scott also was kind of in that same line of thinking. But I really do think that Shawn was the one who really knew what he had and knew what he was able to do with it to make this set of circumstances happen and really create the perfect storm that would be Montreal. The person I feel bad for in all of this situation is Earl Hebner, because what a position to be in. You got to ref a match where Vince is telling you to screw over a guy that you respected, and you've already told, no, I'm not going to screw you over. I will do my best not to screw you over. Can you imagine what was going through Earl Hebner's head leading up to that match? and leading up to that at all, I feel just awful for the guy that he was put in that position where he had to hurt a friend. As I'm sure that Bret and Earl probably felt for each other, and Earl in recent years and in later years decided to turn that into a gimmick of his own, which I don't fault him for, because there was definitely a level that he could take that and use it. But the reason this enters my kayfabe breakers is that Montreal itself, the double cross, isn't necessarily what broke the kayfabe. What broke the kayfabe was the next night. Not so much when Vince said, Bret screwed Bret, time-honored tradition, blah, 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 as much as Vince did break kayfabe a lot in that. I mean, for what was left of it. I mean, the getting out of the athletic commission fee, saying it's entertainment and breaking the kayfabe there. The curtain call had already happened. The steroid trial already happened. But then Vince goes on and says there's a time-honored tradition in pro wrestling where on your way out, you do the job for this guy, and Bret didn't honor that tradition, and Bret screwed Bret, blah, blah, blah. But this is where I think that Bret kind of stooped to Shawn's level, because then, after this happened, Bret went on to every news site and news station saying, I got screwed. It wasn't supposed to be that way. I was supposed to win, blah, 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 blah. And for somebody who took his gimmick so seriously, who took the business so seriously, who took everything about it so seriously, how could you do that? How could, even if, despite the fact that you were very clearly in the right and you were very clearly wronged on that night, how could you do that to the business that you loved so much? And you could see, like, the passion just wasn't in Bret's eyes when he went to WCW. I mean, it really wasn't. It was like the life had been sucked out of him, which to a very large degree I think it was. And I think that's what left Bret kind of as bitter as Bret became, that on top of Goldberg, kicking his head off. But I guess the bottom line with Montreal is that there was just, Montreal was so pivotal to so much, and obviously we all know what happened afterwards, right? WWF took off, Mr. McMahon, the gimmick was born, and he was able to roll with that, and that led to Austin and blah, blah, blah. Although Austin was kind of on a train all its own, but McMahon really was what skyrocketed Austin. There was a lot of good that came out of this bad, but there's also a lot that you got to understand, we got to remember that could have been avoided in this situation just by the simple, basic stuff. And it was just, it was a melting pot, and it was just festering and festering and festering. If Shawn had been more professional, if Bret hadn't gone to the news sites and said this is all fake because, I was supposed to win and Shawn and Vince McMahon screwed me and blah, 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 blah. If Vince hadn't come out and been like, oh, it's time-honored tradition and I'm the babyface, right? It's just, I just feel like there's so much that could have been because of this, but because of this perfect storm, we got Montreal. And I do want to add more to this discussion of Montreal, and maybe we will do a full-fledged episode just on Montreal. Not that everybody hasn't done that already. As if there's anything more to discuss, especially from a perspective like my own. My personal opinion, I mean, I'm trying to do this objectively, but my personal opinion on this, it's Montreal, there was so much that could have changed that would have, I think WWF would not have been the same without it. And really, the guy who came out the ultimate loser in this, unfortunately, was Bret. And it wasn't because Bret wasn't terrific at what he did. It's that Bret went to an inmate asylum running WCW that just had no idea what to do with Bret. And where everyone warned Bret, like, it's going to be a madhouse here. And there's going to be no structure, and there's going to be nothing that you could possibly do that is going to make you look better than you looked leaving WWF. And I think that when it comes to kayfabe, there was a lot that was already broken by kayfabe, but this was really one of those tipping points, as so many people have said, and so many people have documented. This really was a tipping point in kayfabe never coming back. the way that we'd ever expected to or ever would again. You know, any Attitude Era was another big part of that, but really, you look at this single moment, this Montreal Screwjob, which WWE has revisionist historied into calling it the incident in Montreal, I guess to make sure that fault was not placed on Vince, like he was in the right to do it, which, truthfully, I also, in some way, feel bad for Vince. Because Vince didn't want to be put in this position. I mean, I think Vince, if he laid down the law with Shawn Michaels and said, look, you're either going to shape up and be professional about this or you're not getting the belt. I don't care if you go to WCW. They're going to treat you like dog shit anyway. And we're trying to go in a different direction as it is. Because really, when you look at Shawn's shelf life, after Montreal, you got what? 4 months out of Shawn? And then a bunch of other, individual instances. But he was such a non-factor after this that Vince could have easily just pulled the plug on Shawn and said, no, screw you, clean up your shit, or I'm not giving you the belt. You know, we'll pull an angle where, Undertaker hit you backstage or something like that. You know, because Shawn and Taker had a little bit of a feud. They'd already had their Hell in a Cell match a couple months earlier, so you could have made the argument that Taker could have, blasted Shawn earlier and said, no, I'm going to take this title match and win it. And then Bret would have very easily done the job for Taker. I have no doubt that Bret would have been like, not a problem. I respect you so much. I've got no problem dropping the belt to you. And then we avoid that. Would it have been the same? No. Would WWF have been the same? No. But there's so much what ifs in this circumstance that I can't even describe what the what ifs were. And maybe that'd be a fun little episode to do where I invite somebody onto the show who's knows enough about Montreal, where we can kind of fantasize where things would have gone if this had changed or if that had changed or something like that. So this is definitely something I'm going to put on the back burner because there's definitely more to discuss with Montreal, as there always is. But I guess my final thought with this is that there's so much about Montreal that we think about as far as shaping modern wrestling and what it became. And I only wish that more people had seen things from Bret's perspective after WWE had won the war and really started to revise wrestling's history and started seeing it from a more objective, non-WWE point of view. But we got what we got, and that's what it is. And all we can do is move on, look back, and keep making podcasts like this. And with that, we have now moved on to the second half of the show, and you all know what that means. I know what that means, and no hurricane's gonna stop this from happening. Roll that intro!
What time is it? It's the fight, it's the brawl, it's the match of the week. It's tonight, watch along with the son of a beat. It's one fall, the down for the 1, 2, and 3. So don't stall, hang on to the edge of your seat. We got a punch and a flip and a powerbomb too. All the moves and the stars are all under review. See the babyface cheer, then the heels get heat. This is wrestling at its peak. It's the match of the week.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen, it is your match of the week, and I am, well, I would say I'm excited to talk about this one, but after we talk about this, I'm going to explain why I'm not too enthusiastic to talk about it. This match is from Major League Wrestling's Underground. For those of you who did not check out the episode last week, please check out the episode last week. It's on the channel, obviously, but that's the best way to find this video. It's MLW's Underground number 3. They just uploaded it a couple weeks ago. Skip to 37 minutes in. And we are going to have a triple threat match between Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, and Steve Corino. And it is a bunkhouse brawl. And the only thing I'm going to say about this match is that this match was bowling shoe ugly and not in a good way. This was at a time, I believe this was the early 2000s. This was at a time when a lot of the ECW style mayhem was really running amok, and it was kind of, there's a lot of quote-unquote garbage wrestling that let's just beat everybody with what they can and what's around style of match. Corino obviously made his start in ECW, so it's really no surprise that this would be. Joey Styles is on commentary doing solo commentary, which sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? So Dusty cuts a promo that is just and that's a couple minutes before the show. That's like 31 minutes in. Dusty's promo was which for Dusty to have an promo says a lot about the way that things are going to go. So then Terry Funk and Steve Corino, it's announced they're going to be on the next episode of Underground, so you know that there's an upcoming match between them. Immediately when this match starts, Funk and Corino double team Dusty, and they keep going with that. Then Dusty starts making a comeback, hits some bionic elbows, and low blows Terry Funk. Does the babyface. Terry Funk, I guess, is a heel, maybe a tweener. Corino is definitely a heel. But it's hard to say what Funk is in this, except Terry Funk. Rhodes hits a low blow. Styles is doing solo commentary, and I forgot how much I liked Joey Styles. Because Joey Styles, even though he's on his own, is still putting over the talent. And how tough they are, and how athletic they are, and what they're able to do, and the history between Dusty and Terry, and he's putting all these facts in, but he's also letting the guys tell the story. He's letting the boys wrestle, and giving that little airspace to where not everything is so encapsulated by dialogue. You're not hearing absolutely everything being announced, and I kind of like that. Then, out come the garbage cans, and Terry starts throwing garbage cans all the way around, and people start getting hit, and then there's a bunch of cuts, and all of a sudden everybody's busted open. And everybody's busted open. Steve Corino holds Dusty Rhodes back and Terry Funk, instead of hitting Dusty in the head, hits Steve in the head, and all of a sudden Funk's double crossed. Then everybody's busted open. Terry Funk gets a snow shovel out of nowhere. And this seems to be a trend with the matches that we've chosen with Terry Funk. As in all of those brooms that we saw with Jerry Lawler. And so Terry gets a snow shovel and then shoves the snow shovel, the point of the snow shovel, into the throat of Steve Corino, and that looked devastating. And that was probably the most entertaining. That was probably the thing that made me pop the most in this whole match. Everybody's slow. Everybody is just kind of lanking around, moseying around. Everybody's bleeding. Then Terry goes to the outside. He's got Steve Corino on the outside. And Terry goes to, there's a bent rail. I don't know what happened with this thing. We missed this. But one of the outside barricades, one of those little metal frame gate barricades, is on its side and bent in half. And Terry goes to, step up on it, but he trips and falls, and he just falls and just lays there and sells the fact that he just slipped and fell, so that whatever he was going to try to do, he just didn't do. And everyone kind of laughs, and then just, nobody knows what to do. So Corino goes over and just starts, hammering Terry Funk. And and at that moment, Joey Styles says a great little bit of commentary, and he goes, and Terry Funk doesn't even drink. And they say, well, but after this match, I'm sure all three are going to down a whole bottle of Wild Turkey. And I just thought that was a funny little moment from Joey. Joey's got some great little one-liners there that make me laugh. Then, then Dusty gets escorted out because I guess he's super hurt or he just can't move. I don't know. It's very hard to tell because it's really just been a whole bunch of random punches and nothing really makes sense in this match, which to have Terry Funk and Dusty Rhodes in a match that doesn't make any sense at all, it's just it's disheartening but it's a little sad. This match was really kind of just sad. We were talking about wrestlers past their prime. They really got exposed in this match. They really got exposed for being past what they were able to do. Then C.W. Anderson and Simon Diamond come along and help Steve Corino make this little ECW reunion. And they start beating up Terry Funk and they start throwing him down. And then, Dusty tries to come back and they try to go after him, but they don't really go after him. And then Joey Styles says the best line of the entire night, I don't understand any of this. Me either, Joey. I don't understand any of what's going down. This is just confusing. It doesn't make any sense. Funk's just throwing trash cans everywhere. And then Corino hits the referee because the referee refuses to count because Anderson and Simon Diamond cover Terry, and the referee's not going to count a cover that two people earn in the match. He's not going to cover that. So Corino hits the referee and then throws a steel chair into the referee's ball sack. They throw him over, and then everybody stacks on top of Funk with Corino at the top, and then 1, 2, 3. Corino wins. There was I guess this is a new faction that Corino and C.W. Anderson and Simon Diamond start, and good God, this match was bowling shoe ugly. It was rough. It was just rough. I didn't understand a lick of this. It made no sense. Nothing was entertaining in my eyes. You know, Corino got boos, you know, at the end because they was, you know, I was just glad to see this over. You know, it wasn't like I was elated to see that this match had stopped happening, which is never a good thing. It's never good when you're excited and thankful that the match is over, not because it was exciting, but because it was just mercifully over. This match was bad. It was just bad. It made no sense. Everybody bled for no reason. People were throwing shit at each other. It's just, I never want to see this match ever again. And this is no fault of Steve Corino. I'm sure he tried. I mean, the thing was, Steve Corino really should have been the one bumping for these two guys over and over, and really that just didn't happen. It just, I don't even have the words to describe it. Like Joey Styles said, I just don't understand any of this, and I'm not gonna, and I pray that this match, maybe this match should have stayed underground. That's all I'm gonna say about that. But with that said, we're moving on to our Superstar Spotlight, and I'm not going to take too long talking about this, but we're going to talk about Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes, his career obviously goes without saying, is one of the best careers of any pro wrestler, I think, of all time. His charisma, the way he moved in the ring, the way he was able to transition and also accentuate the fact that not only was he a worker that really could get the best out of somebody, both in being a babyface and selling, but also being a heel. There's a great match, I think it was in Japan, of Bob Backlund, the babyface, going up against a heel Dusty Rhodes in the 70s when Backlund was WWF champion, and they were still, I want to say it was New Japan, but it might have been All Japan, but I think it was New Japan because it was, you know, that was kind of Inoki's deal, is he was bringing people like that in to get the American wrestlers, and Inoki did a lot of that. Or maybe it was Baba. I don't know. I'm not as up to date on Japanese wrestling history as perhaps I should be. But there was a great match between those two for like 45 minutes where Dusty was the heel. You know, he could be a heel when he wanted to be, but he was such an energetic and charismatic babyface. We watched the show, we watched the match of the week with him and Gino Hernandez, which was great. When Gino had that headlock in, that bicep headlock that Dusty sold so well and put Gino over as such a beast and such a powerful guy. He knew how to invoke emotion from the crowd, not only through his promos, but through his in-ring action. His subtleties were so on point that you couldn't help but be attracted to Dusty Rhodes and what he was doing. When he won the title in '84 against Ric Flair, and that was one of the biggest pops, you know, tore the house down with him and Flair. And of course, you know, later on in '86 when they had another match. And Dusty, his career as the son of a plumber and being able to not only talk and tell where you needed to go and how to put butts in the seats, not only through how you said things, but how you moved and how you talked and how you conducted yourself in your ring presence. There's nobody quite like Dusty Rhodes in this wrestling industry. And it was evidenced when he became the booker, when he was doing stuff in Florida and the Carolinas, and then, of course, when he took over in Crockett. And not everything that Dusty ever did was genius, but it was still something that it would make sense. It was logical. It may have been ridiculous. Some of the things he did, of course, were ridiculous. It's pro wrestling, but he always tried to fit it into the confines of what pro wrestling at its core is. And he's one of those guys. There's some people who enter a business and they just get it. And Dusty Rhodes just got it. He knew how to do things, when to do things, and where to do things that made everybody so excited to see him, and excited that no matter what he did, he was always going to be recognized and remembered as one of the all-time greats. And then when he transitioned from that into the commentary on WCW, I was never a huge fan of Dusty's commentary, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't doing his best to put over the talent that was in front of him. I didn't think he belonged in the NWO, to tell you the truth, and it really didn't do anything for him. And, we were talking about past prime wrestlers. I mean, that was kind of at a point where Dusty was really kind of done with that. And to me, there's nobody like Dusty. And you talk to all the wrestlers now and how influential Dusty was on all of them, especially that FCW crowd. And then when NXT really started getting off the ground, and what he was able to do for NXT, and how that started, and how valuable he was with promo classes, and what he was able to talk about, and the information, the vital information that really only he was able to express and know. And he was so supportive, and he was such a family man. He loved his kids, and he wanted to make sure that he was able to bestow on them what he knew, as well as what he knew to all the new talent, to make them as good as they possibly could be. Truly, Dusty Rhodes is one of a kind. And it's been 5 years now since he's passed, but it's hard to get his name out of people's mouths, as it shouldn't be, because Dusty is one of the premier epitomes of what pro wrestling right is. From start to finish, top to bottom, there is really no one like Dusty Rhodes. That's why everybody has an impression of Dusty Rhodes, because he was just that influential on wrestling as a whole. And really, pro wrestling would never have been the same without him. It may not have ever even reached the levels that it did without Dusty. Say what you want about Vince and what he was trying to do, and obviously the machine that he was turning into place, but really, there's so much about Dusty that was so vital to what created modern pro wrestling, what created pro wrestling as we know it, that he arguably deserves recognition. I would put him in, everyone likes to do those Mount Rushmores. Dusty Rhodes belongs, in my eyes, in a Mount Rushmore as far as the most influential people in the wrestling business. Top to bottom, start to finish. I love Dusty, and we will do more Dusty Rhodes matches, I'm sure, in matches of the week, so that we can get just a little bit more so we can see the bigger picture of just how great he was. And I miss Dusty from what I've known of Dusty, which I had to go back and learn. I had to go back and learn a lot about Dusty Rhodes, and I recommend all of you to do the same, because he is part of what brought me here. It's part of what is making me have this podcast, is guys like Dusty Rhodes, and why we have people like Cody and Dustin, and how great they are and how great they've been, and what we will see going forward. Thank you, Dusty, for everything. There's too much to mention, but thank you, Dusty, for everything. And with that said, it is now time for our first commercial break. When we get back, which is going to be shorter than we think, we're going to have Skylar Greenberg back on the show for another great edition. We're not doing the ACPW NWL show yet. That's in 2 weeks' time. But we're just going to have Skylar Greenberg on the show just to be here, and we're going to have some good times. We're going to continue a game that we started with Josh Ageddon. We're going to have a lot more to go on from there, but you're going to have to stay tuned to find out. So thank you very much for listening this week. We will see you next week, and we will be right back.